The content of the following program, including all statements from the host and guests, is to provide general information and commentary about the law. Under no circumstances does any statement made by a host or guest to a caller or listener constitute legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, and the material from this program should not be viewed as a substitute for personal consultation with an attorney. Welcome to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese, who brings you all the latest news in the legal world. Jeff will be discussing a variety of legal topics with experts in the field. If you would like to ask a question or share a story on the air, please call toll-free 888-565-1470. Once again, that's 888-565-1470. Now, let's talk legal with Jeff Van Treese.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of Talk Legal. I'm your host, Jeff Van Treese. I'm an attorney with the law firm Oltman, Flynn & Kubler, where we practice intellectual property law, including patents, trademarks, and copyrights. You can check us out online and view all episodes of this show on our website at oltmanpatent.com. That's oltmanpatent.com. I'd like to thank all of our listeners, including those of you tuning in on the AM dial, as well as those watching online. If you have a question, comment, or story that you'd like to share on the air, please feel free to call us toll-free at 888-565-1470. We welcome your calls. I have a special guest in studio this evening, Penter Holmes. He's been here before, and he is walking in right now. He got stuck in traffic, but fortunately he made it here in one piece. So I'd like to welcome Penter to the show.
Good afternoon. Good evening.
Well, thanks so much for coming. You came right in the nick of time. So I did the introduction for the show. I'd like to move on to our topic this evening. We're going to be discussing some of the news from the past week, specifically the tragedy in Texas, the Sandra Bland case in which she was pulled over by a police officer, and was subsequently arrested, and then she died under disputed circumstances in her jail cell. So when we look at this case, this brings up so many issues. It brings up the issue of potential allegations of police misconduct, but also the rights of the citizen during a stop, which are not quite understood at this point. You practice in a variety of areas, but you've done some defense work in criminal law, and this is very a difficult situation because we really don't know what our rights are, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's one of the strange things about this case is the stop itself. Before we get into the discussion or the dispute between the officer and Sandra Bland that led to her being arrested, the question remains as to why did he pull her over in the first place? According to Sandra Bland, she noticed that he was following her, and she moved over to let him pass. And when she moved over to let him pass, he pulled her over for failing to use her signal light. And this is what's called a pretextual stop, where they want to stop, where the police want to stop an individual for whatever reason, to investigate for whatever reason, but they'll find some type of traffic infraction that they can claim justifies the stop in the first place. But this is a person that was really just driving down the street. The police caught the police's eye, and the police create this pretextual stop just to stop her. Not for anything that was egregious or flagrant. It was not because she was violating any traffic laws. It was because they wanted to stop her, and they stopped her.
That's the thing. Like you said, it's a pretext. They're just coming up with a reason to stop someone. Now, the Supreme Court has held that even if the motives of law enforcement are not up to snuff, if they have illegitimate motives, so long as there's probable cause, including a traffic violation, they can stop whoever they want.
This is a case in which Supreme Court precedent and where bad facts make bad laws. The Supreme Court upheld pretextual stops, but they did it in a case that involved a drug dealer in D.C., Washington, D.C., if I'm not mistaken. The police had observed the drug dealer with suspicious activity. They knew that there was drug dealing going on in that area, and they pulled the drug dealer over under a similar traffic infraction or false or fake traffic infraction, and they created what was a pretextual stop. And no one wants a bad guy to go free. And so the defense in that case was, well, they had no reason to pull me over in the first place, or the reason in which they pulled me over in the first place was a made up reason. Well, again, we don't want drug dealers to go free. So the Supreme Court set the precedent. Well, it doesn't matter why they pulled you over. They pulled you over, deal with it. Well, now we see that being applied across the board, across the country, where pretextual stops are okay. And this is what happened. This was a pretextual stop. A person simply just driving down the street, caught the police eye. They said, well, let me just pull him over, see what's going on. And, 3 days later, 3 days in jail, and, we have the tragedy that we have.
And that's one of the situations we see with a lot of courts, is that they bend over backwards to try to legitimize the arrest. And they did it in a case which there was potentially a serious crime that took place that was then subsequently prosecuted. But then you create a precedent which then just applies to everyone and essentially paves the way for living in a police state, unfortunately.
And it's over and over and over. We've seen the Supreme Court simply defer to, defer to the police officer on the field, in the field. Some of the commentary coming out of the Supreme Court cases are, we don't want to put ourselves, judging a police officer who's putting their life on the line. And that's true. I mean, we have to respect and we have to support the difficult job that police officers do. And it is incredibly difficult. Every stop has the potential to be life-threatening. On the same token, we live in a democracy, with the idea that we don't have to hide from government, where we can be safe in our own persons. And, it always goes back to that. Who are we trying to protect? Are we trying to protect the government from the citizens, or the citizens from the government?
I think that gets back to the spirit of the Constitution, which is that if those in a position of power, the government, that includes the police, are going to exercise control or authority over a citizen, that the burden's on them to justify why that's necessary. And sometimes what we see in the discourse and the debate that happens after an event like this is they start talking about the officer's safety and the officer's judgment and so forth. But the burden's on the officer to say why this person had to be deprived of their liberty.
Exactly. All too often we hear, well, what could she have done differently? Well, a citizen should be able to be a citizen in their person.
And most importantly, the Constitution puts limits on the government.
Exactly.
It doesn't put limits on the citizen. The citizen can be rude. The citizen can be disrespectful of the officer. That doesn't create probable cause that a crime was committed, and it doesn't justify an arrest.
Right, and one of the things in which a lot of commentators have pointed out was, well, a police officer was right to tell her to get out the car, because the Supreme Court has upheld that a police officer can instruct a citizen to get out their car, or an individual to get out their car, when there's fear of safety. Well, in this case, it wasn't fear of safety. It was, he told her to put out a cigarette. She had a combative attitude about putting out her cigarette. Why do I have to put out my cigarette in my own car? And that is what led to the arrest. It wasn't because of fear of safety. There was nothing on the video or nothing within the police report that indicated that he was afraid that she was going to attack him, sitting in a car smoking a cigarette. Nothing. It was a pretextual stop that became confrontational because it was pretextual. Let's make no mistake about it. It was a pretextual stop that was confrontational because a person doesn't want to be pulled over for no reason. Shocking, I know, but if you pull over a person for no reason when they're trying to get out of your way, yes, they're going to be agitated. And then when you tell them that, you force them to get out their vehicle because they won't put out their cigarette, which they have every right to smoke, yes, they're going to be agitated. And in the ensuing confrontation, the series of commands that the police officer issued, were I believe a lot of people would find them confusing, especially under the under the stress of the situation. Now, we don't see Sandra Bland striking the officer. We don't see any of that. But what we do hear on the video is, "You slammed my head into the ground," where the police officer's response is, "Good." Wow. If that doesn't really strike fear into the common person's heart, if you can't get in your car and drive to the store without being pulled over for no reason, and then forced out of your vehicle, and then potentially slammed to the ground and find yourself in jail facing to pay a $5,000 bond, and if you can't come up with it, you're just going to sit there until you can. That doesn't put fear in the average citizen's heart. I just don't know what would.
Well, there's a couple things there. The Fourth Amendment probable cause requirement is meant to stop the police from acting arbitrarily. That is, they can't just pull you over for no reason. They can't deprive you of your liberty for no reason, just on a whim, just on a hunch. And that's what appears to have happened here. This is the very thing that our founding fathers were trying to prevent when they wrote the Fourth Amendment, was to stop police from just whimsically detaining somebody. And there was no reason here. And like you said, with the smoking the cigarette, she had every right to smoke that cigarette. And the officer didn't actually order her to stop. He said, "Would you please put out your cigarette?" That's a request, not an order. And I've had on this show Warren Redlick. He's the developer of the DUI flyer, which I have right here. I'll give you a copy here, which actually sort of incorporates incorporates this issue into the story from this week, which is that you don't want to necessarily consent to something that you're not ordered to do. In other words, if somebody says please do something, if the officer asks you to please do something, and you do it, then you've consented. So it says, "Can I please search your car?
Right.
Can you please get out of the car? Can you please do this?" Those aren't orders. So if you do them, then you will be deemed by the courts to have consented.
Right.
He didn't order you to do these things. So when she said, "I have every right to continue smoking my cigarette," she was responding to a request. He said, "Would you please do it?" She said, "I'd rather not." If he said, "I order you," or "I command you to put out your cigarette," that would be a different story, but that's not what he said. So since he didn't actually give her an order, she didn't disobey any order, therefore there's no resistance.
Even if he had given her an order, right? Is that a lawful order? Under what basis is he making that order? If he said, "Well, I'm making it's his comments. I was asking her to put out the cigarette because the smoke was getting into my eye, and I felt, that I couldn't conduct the rest of the stop, with her smoking." Is that consistent with previous past behavior of the officer? I mean, it's so much here that, again, when we weigh these facts, we have to weigh them on the side of the citizen, right? And we always, when we think of police officers, we think of people who are out to protect and serve, and by golly, they are, right? And for the vast majority of the police officers, that's, it's a noble profession. And even in this case, I can't say that this guy is a bad guy. But what happens with systematic abuses is when the system is left unchecked or left to check itself, what the norm is for the system starts to shift. It starts to move. It starts to, okay, well, we can do this now. Well, we can do this now. And over time, I think you start looking at a number of these police cases that permeate across the board, and you're like, wow, what's going on here? There was an article in the Washington Post, fascinating article this weekend, in which a guy says, "I went to Iraq, and he invaded Iraq, and he came back, and he was invaded at home." And this is talking about, this is a Caucasian male who he came home one evening. It was a Saturday evening, and he came home, got in bed, and went to sleep. He woke up with police officers having their guns drawn, pointed at him while he's laying in bed. Now, I guess one of his neighbors reported that he was a squatter, and because they didn't know, they reported that a potential squatter. But police broke into the home, and basically apprehended him at gunpoint. And once everything was figured out and settled down, he was let go, no charges pressed or anything like that. And he said, "Well, why don't you guys just call the management or check the records? It's on my license. It's like, why don't you guys just do any investigation? Like, why did you resort to such military tactics where any false move that I made or any move that if I would have woke up and I saw people breaking into my house that would have reacted negatively, I could have been shot. Why didn't you guys just do more due diligence?" And the response that they got is that, well, apprehending the subject was took highest priority, and the use of force was necessary to make sure that for the officer's safety. That's where we've got. That's where we're at right now. Unless there's a check on police behavior, not that the individual police officer is bad, but that the system, and including the laws going up into the Supreme Court for pretextual stops, has gotten to the point in which it's really hard for a police officer to do anything wrong. And the person checking the police officer is another police officer.
That's, again, one of the big problems is that it's sort of like the fox in the hen house. And you have a system. There was the case I think it was about a month or so, at a pool party where there was this young woman that was thrown to the ground, and the officer that was on videotape, he was just acting erratic. He was acting egregiously. And one of the things a lot of people pointed out was that there were 10 officers there, which that's questionable in and of itself, is to break up a loud noise at a pool party, why you would need that many officers. But putting that aside, 10 officers or so acted professionally and one didn't. But when you're pulled over, you don't know whether you are going to be accosted by that one, whether it's a small percentage. You don't know whether you're going to encounter a bad cop when you're pulled over. And so there's reason. Just like the officer doesn't know when they're pulling you over, whether you're a fugitive that's going to be a danger, or whether you're just somebody late for work that's speeding. They don't know. You don't know who you're dealing with either. And so that's why lawyers usually advise people not to consent to anything and to remain silent.
And again, it always comes back to the respondents who are saying, well, the police officer we have to look out for police officer safety. We have to look out for the police officer safety. We have to look out for the police officer safety. And that is fundamentally true. That is I can't say that enough. But part of the police officer safety is is gaining trust in the community. It's not having pretextual stops. It's about, we have to look out for the officer safety, but the officer safety can't trump citizens' rights. It just can't. It
can't, because the Constitution's the supreme law of the land, and if that means anything, then that means that the Bill of Rights have to be respected.
Right. Individuals have to be respected. And we always must remember that the officer is the first line of government, right? So really when a person says, well, we have to look out for the officer's safety, what they're saying is we have to look out for the government's safety, right? The government's safety is more important than the individual's rights. The government's safety is more important than individuals' rights. And, I always find it ironic that the same people who cry and bemoan the impact of taxes, often are the ones that want to give the most passes to officers' incursions on individual liberty. And I always say to myself, well, you can't have it both ways, right? One is, both are intrusions of the government on the individual. One is more egregious, right? If you literally can't pay a $5,000 fee, you're going to be stuck in jail. And, you can go to any of the local jails, whether it's Palm Beach, Broward, or Miami, and you'll find people in jail that can't afford to pay $50, right? So their bond is, $500. They have to pay $50.
Might as well be $5 million.
It might as well be $5 million. And so when people say, well, she probably did kill herself, I think you missed the point, right? I think you missed the point, because here's a lady who is looking for a new job. She's just moved to a new area. and she's in jail on a $5,000 bond. Let's say that she had to pay 10%, which is $500. Well, she's been in jail for 3 days because she couldn't come up with that money, right? And her family and friends couldn't come up with that money. And we don't know if she talked to another family member or another someone who was supposed to put the money up, who told her that, you know what, you're going to have to sit there for a couple more days because we just can't come up with the money. Rent's due, lights due, bills are due, right? We just don't have $500 right now to get you out. We'll get you out as soon as we can. And so that I'm just driving down the street to go to the store or whatever she was doing turns into 3 days in jail, 4 days in jail, 5 days in jail. And her one of the cellmates that was near her, she recalls telling her, said, well, they can't hold you forever. 3 days can feel like forever.
It can. They're like dog years when you're in a confined situation. And most people, when you're looking at these situations and they're dissected by the talking heads on the media and so forth, you're sort of looking at it in the abstract.
Right.
And you're not really putting yourselves in the shoes of the person that's there. And you have to ask yourself, have you ever been detained? Have you ever been detained for 10 minutes?
10 minutes.
Can you imagine being detained for 3 days?
3 days. And you don't know is that 3 days going to turn to 4 days or 5 days or 6 days? The burden that it places on you, your family, and the embarrassment that you've had. Her car is in the impound. Will she be able to get it out? The towing fee, the storage fees. Let's say the towing fee on average is $75. The storage fee is $75 a day. She's 3 days in jail, 3 days for storage. I mean, she could be looking at several $1,000s, without even having an attorney.
And this is just such a tragic situation. She was 28 years old. She had just gotten a job at her alma mater. She was apparently elated about this. She may have had some mental health issues previously, and she might have been worried that this arrest might have cost her new job that she was going to go
Absolutely.
to. And that could have been enough to send her over the edge. If she did commit suicide, then that's a horrible tragedy. At the same time, this is something that potentially could have been prevented. If she had a history of mental illness, this is something that law enforcement should have been aware of.
In Florida, the presumption is that a person should be released on their own recognizance. But you look at the charges that she faced, which was assaulting a public officer or something similar to, and we don't want a person like that on the streets. And you go back and you say, she was just driving down the street trying to get out the officer's way. And the officer conducted a stop because he wanted to, on his own prerogative, because he felt like it. And you say, man, that can't be that can't be our government.
Yeah.
That can't be our government. We can't be throwing people in jail for that. Can we?
And the thing is this brings up issues about driving while black and issues about racial discrimination. Unfortunately, we can't get inside his head and figure out what his motives were, but we can say, even if that was not his motivation, the actions were still egregious. They were still wrongful, regardless.
Yeah, I mean, I think someone pointed out that it may have been because she had out-of-state tags, right? That could have been, he sees a car, out-of-state tags. What's that car doing here? I'm going to investigate. Whatever the reason is, it's not a good one. It's not a good one.
It's not a good one, and in fact, this brings up some of the issues that have come up with this flyer. We literally don't know, and even lawyers can't say definitively what we are required to do as citizens if we're pulled over. So if you look at, for example, the checkpoint situation, which has come up, it's not clear as to whether you have the right to remain silent at a checkpoint. I mean, we're always taught we have the right to remain silent.
Right.
Most lawyers would say, yes, you have the right to remain silent. The Fourth Amendment is just absolute on that issue. But through hair splitting done by courts, trying to bend over backwards to acquiesce to the objectives of law enforcement, we don't really know what rights we have.
Whenever I see this sign, I'm like, man, that's a great intention. But I think, in practice, if you're on South Beach, you put this up on a Friday night, good luck.
Well, in Warren's defense, what he's always said is that this will really only work if you're recording it. And you have to be recording it from enough angles that you can capture on
Right.
film what's happening.
Right. And it only
Otherwise-
works as a defense later on. It still won't stop you from being arrested and taken to jail. It may stop the charges from sticking. Right. It may, once the cameras or once it comes evident and that you were exercising this right that we have, and it may be a defense later on down the road, but stopping you from being arrested at that point in time, only if the officer respects it, right? And frankly, even if the officer respects it, does the magistrate that's doing the bond hearing respect it? Does the judge, that's doing the intake or the first hearing respect it? Do the prosecutors who's prosecuting the case respect it? So
I
you
can
could
actually tell you that they don't, because we've seen from an internal memo from the Florida State Attorney's Office that addressed this flyer right here, where it says, "Thus, I'm not opening my window," and it asks you to put any tickets under the windshield wiper. This is something that prosecutors are saying the police get to determine how a ticket is administered, how service is provided.
Right.
And this is something that is certainly not clear in any law or in the Constitution. It's just the position prosecutors are saying is police can say whether or not you have to open your window, but that's not clear. So you have defense lawyers saying one thing, prosecutors saying something else. What is the average layperson citizen who's in this situation that's pulled over at a stop or at a checkpoint? What are they supposed to do?
I always say that, your best bet, is you don't want to fight. You don't want to be a constitutional case, right? It's fine, it's noble, but you do want to comply with the officers, right? And, and I often say, you don't want to consent to any searches, and you want to keep your communication as minimal as possible. But you do want to be polite, and you do want to be courteous, and you do want to be respectful of the job that the police officer has. But individually, no one wants to be that constitutional case, right? No one wants to be the Sandra Bland who says, well, my rights were violated, So on an individual basis, that's not what we want, right? But for policymakers, that's something in which policymakers, whether it's our state policymakers, our local representatives and state senators, because our state constitution is a powerful thing. We often fall back to the federal constitution, but our state constitution is there too.
We're going to have to leave it at that. I'd like to give a very special thanks to my guest, Penter Holmes. Please tune in next week, Tuesday night from 6 to 6:30, where my guest will be estate and probate attorney Adam Goldberg. Real quick, could you give out your contact information?
You can find us online at www.blindearlaw.com.
Thank you so much, and have a great evening.
Thank you for listening to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese. Tune in next week for more insightful and exciting information about the law. You can contact Jeff by email at jvt2law@gmail.com or give him a call at 561-789-6866. That's 561-789-6866. The content of the preceding program, including all statements from the host